Thank you, Mr. Vice President, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here. And thank you for providing me with the opportunity to share some of our experiences from the Netherlands and the way they translate to international cooperation. The international dimension is very important to us, hence the title International Engagement in Counter-Terrorism. Because terrorism, it has been said many times, is an international phenomenon that affects us all. Terrorist acts anywhere are terrorist acts everywhere. But of course that doesn't mean that different regions are affected equally by the scourge of terrorism. The press in the Netherlands focuses understandably on terrorist attacks close to home in Europe, but it's sobering to note that at least 3/4 last year of all victims died in 5 countries outside Europe: Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Certainly this region has a long history of terrorism and counter-terrorism, which is one of the reasons why I'm very glad to be here. And I understand many of the regional reasons much better after the impressive lineup of yesterday and today during this conference. Geography matters. In November last year, we had the pleasure of receiving a delegation from Israel in the Netherlands to exchange views on counterterrorism and foreign policy, which was an open and fruitful exchange, which at the same time made clear that in some critical ways, our approaches are different. From its inception in 1948, Israel has lived through a wide range of terror attacks from groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and others. And life under the shadow of terror has inspired some of the most rigorous counterterrorism measures in the world. Of course, such measures to protect Israel's citizens from terrorist attacks have at times attracted international criticism, and sometimes we've chimed in, but always as a friend. I'm keenly aware of the threat that has inspired the Israeli policy on counterterrorism, and which is the main reason for the difference in our approach. I'm also aware of Israel's new counterterrorism bill that was designed to strike a balance between the state's security interest and its need to safeguard the fundamental principles of the liberal democratic system and the human rights that it protects. Aside from this important balance that we heard the Minister of Justice about yesterday, is the question of the underlying grievances, and for sustainable solutions, these will ultimately need to be addressed as well, and I'll come back to that. But let me first turn to the Netherlands. For the moment, and from a European perspective, it feels as if my country is in the eye of the storm, that quiet spot of calm surrounded by the forces of destruction. While we mourn the victims of terrorist attacks in Paris, Brussels, Berlin, and London, not to mention the victims in countries that I mentioned farther away, we have been fortunate enough to escape one ourselves. Would this be good fortune or design? It's hard to prove a negative, so we'll never know for sure. But our storm flags are up because we cannot sit back hoping that the threat will blow over. There were too many escapes. One of the perpetrators of the horrible attacks last year at Zaventem airport in Brussels traveled through Amsterdam airport. An attack on the high-speed train that was thwarted by courageous people on the train came from the Netherlands and was on its way to France. So plots were prevented, and plots, in addition, were prevented when a weapons cache was discovered in the city of Rotterdam. So the threat is real, and it's amplified by the 285 Dutch men and increasingly women that heeded the call from the so-called caliphate to join Daesh, of which 50 have returned and at least 55 had died. Their departure tore up families, while those returning can pose an increased risk, for we don't know their motivations and skills they acquired in the theater. This is unlike what we experienced before. The end of our colonial rule led to a number of serious hijackings in the 70s, and in the same period we had sporadic terrorist attacks, basically resulting from events in neighboring countries. And then we had leftist revolutionary attacks that caused a lot of destruction, but fortunately no casualties. That mainly shows how different motivations of terrorists and their acts can be. But the threats that we witness in the last few decades is different, and our response has to evolve as well. Nobody is born a terrorist, so there are stages leading in the minds of some to the conviction that violence, terrorist violence, is the response to real and perceived grievances. To get to their root, we have to trace back these stages and change the course. While our first instinct is to look at general patterns and templates, it's now commonly understood that every individual goes through his or her own life cycle of radicalization, and we have to pay attention to this. It requires tailor-made responses with the right balance between preventive, punitive, and curative measures. While the public cries for bold, hard, and strong measures, we have to be able to speak softly as well. An example of our approach is the local tables that we organize when we see signs of radicalization at the community level. Both hard and soft actors, so to speak, get together to design the best mix of measures. Obviously, this requires a level of trust between social workers, educators, neighborhood cops, and municipal security officers, and that trust doesn't come overnight. The number of administrative measures and grounds for prosecution have greatly increased in the last 3 years, and the challenge remains to design a balanced approach instead of throwing all available measures at the subject. A lot has been said in the last few days about drivers of radicalization and root causes, and that indeed easily becomes a nebulous affair. Patterns are not always clear, relations are not always causal, but what is clear to us is that it is a task for all of us to work towards an open and inclusive society, towards equal opportunities, and to combat racism and discrimination. We are certainly never finished with that, and we have to keep fine-tuning our approach. But we are strongly committed to this balance between hard and soft measures, and that in turn provides a basis for our engagement abroad. Terrorism doesn't stop at borders, and we need absolutely international cooperation. That means bombing Daesh supply lines with the global coalition against Daesh, in which we are active, and it also means increased intelligence sharing, for example, between European agencies in the Counter-Terrorism group, an initiative we took during our the Netherlands EU presidency last year. But it also means diplomatic engagement to share best practices and help each other develop responses. We do that bilaterally through our embassies and network of CT diplomats and through multilateral organizations and initiatives. Yesterday and this morning we heard several excellent interventions from UN colleagues, but let me mention here the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, and not only because it's chaired by the Netherlands and Morocco. It's worth mentioning its composition, 29 countries and the European Union, and many of the 29 are Muslim majority countries, and that's good. They are in many ways our allies. Yesterday, there was much debate whether Sunni or Shia Islam was the greatest threat, and that to me seems not the right question. We certainly have decided to make it our joint mission to prevent, combat, and prosecute terrorist acts, to counter recruitment and to counter incitement. The GCTF brings together experts and practitioners to share experiences and expertise and to develop tools and strategies how to counter the terrorist threat. Let me mention a few examples of initiatives taken by our forum. Our cooperation to stem the flow of foreign terrorist fighters, a toolbox to share instruments and best practices for intervention at different stages in the life cycle of radicalization, and the Soft Targets initiative, which aims at better protecting our everyday locations in an open society. Israel, while not a member of the GCTF, took an active part in this initiative and has provided valuable experiences and insights. The GCTF has helped strengthen the international CT architecture by implementing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and by inspiring the foundation of new institutions that help to translate what's on paper into reality. An example is the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, or GSERF in short, and that fund aims to raise $200 million from public and private actors, and the money is used to address root causes by supplying local community-level initiatives aimed at strengthening resilience against violent extremism. About $15 million has already been committed to a project in the pilot states Bangladesh, Mali, and Nigeria, with expansion to Kosovo and Kenya underway. And as a board member, it would be foolish for me not to use this stage to call for generous donations to give this initiative the wings that it will need to fly further. Next week in New York, the GCTF will hold its 8th ministerial meeting, coinciding with the UN Ministerial Week during the General Assembly, and we are hoping to show the results of the initiatives on soft targets and on countering violent extremism and terrorism online. To my mind, incidentally, countering violent extremism and counter-terrorism are complementary and certainly not mutually exclusive. We will launch a few new initiatives, including one on the nexus between organized crime and terrorism. Criminal and terrorist networks are feeding off each other in very unhealthy ways, and we need to find the right pressure points for disrupting and dismantling these networks. It's no coincidence that the ministerial meeting is scheduled next week, as there are close links between the GCTF and the United Nations, in particular the Security Council. One was the initiative, the Dutch-Moroccan initiative that I mentioned already on the threat of foreign terrorist fighters in Syria and Iraq, which led to Security Council Resolution 2178. It creates binding obligations for UN member states to stop individuals believed to be foreign terrorist fighters from crossing their borders, to stop and ban funding or facilitating such individuals, and to prosecute, rehabilitate, and reintegrate returning foreign terrorist fighters, and to stop recruiting, organizing, transporting, and equipping anyone going abroad for terrorist acts or training. And this resolution, while it's a resolution, it's on paper, but it led to new legislation and new practices in over 60 countries. Which brings me at the end to our upcoming Dutch membership of the Security Council in 2018, where we will focus on counterterrorism as one of our priorities. I mentioned this resolution 2178 because we are now in the further stage, and when we see the caliphate disintegrate, we are of the view that we need an update of that resolution. Finally, also to say that we are part of the European Union, where the free movement of people, goods and services is one of the building blocks of our cooperation. But as a consequence of our open borders, we have to keep on improving our cooperation to tackle the threats of terrorism. And we have already made great strides in coupling the different intra-EU databases, for instance, through Europol, but much remains to be done. We will have to weather this storm for the foreseeable future. Our governments have to be agile and responsive to the evolving nature of the terrorist threat without forgoing our humanity. Open societies always are vulnerable, but they also provide strength and resilience which we must value and protect. Nobody is born a terrorist, and if we do our job well, it's not necessary to die as one. Thank you.
ICT.